Welcome to The Explainer. We're skipping the usual history book version of early America today. Instead, we're doing a corporate autopsy on a massive, chaotic 17th century startup venture. You know, when we picture Jamestown, it's usually brave explorers, right? But underneath all that, it was literally just a huge, incredibly risky financial gamble bankrolled by London venture capitalists. And just look at this number, 80%. That is the staggering mortality rate for those early settlers. It really exposes the grim reality hiding behind the company's slick marketing. I mean, when you realize that on average, only about 20% of the workforce survived their first few months on the ground, the whole traditional narrative of Jamestown just completely shifts. So that brings us to the core question we're answering in this explainer. How exactly did a joint stock company, one that hemorrhaged hundreds of thousands of pounds over 18 years, accidentally give birth to American democracy? Well, it's a wild ride of corporate pivots, boardroom brawls, and some truly massive unintended consequences. Section 1. America's first startup venture. To really get what Jamestown was all about, you've got to follow the money. Back in the early 1600s, the English crown was swimming in debt. They absolutely did not want the financial risk of setting up a colony to compete with Spain. So the venture capitalists step in. They formed a joint stock company to underwrite the whole colony as a private for-profit business. The idea was simple. If the venture tanked, the catastrophic financial losses would hit the private shareholders, not bankrupt the king. And their 1606 business plan? Incredibly ambitious. We're talking finding gold and silver, discovering a northwest passage to China, exploiting natural resources, the whole shebang. They expected a massive return on investment, practically overnight. But of course, this was completely detached from the brutal, wilderness realities their workers were actually about to face. Now here's the kicker. The investors took on literally all the financial burden, while King James I took absolutely zero risk. But he still made sure the first charter guaranteed the crown a cool 20% cut of all gold and silver profits, plus 15% of any copper. Honestly, it was the ultimate win-win for the monarch and just a massive, massive gamble for the shareholders. Moving on to Section 2, the marketing spin versus the reality. So how exactly do you attract a workforce and capital for such a dangerous gig? Well, through a really intense marketing campaign. They literally advertised Virginia as this Garden of Eden, a place where wealth was just lying around on the ground. But compare that fantasy to the reality: horrifying starvation, disease, and brutal martial law. I mean, during the starving time winter of 1609 to 1610, the workforce almost died out completely. And yet back in London, the company just kept aggressively marketing this paradise strictly to keep that investment capital flowing. Because the reality was so incredibly grim, the company was in a constant state of restructuring just to stave off total collapse. We see the first charter in 1606, but by 1609, the second charter transferred power away from the King's Council directly to the investors. And by 1612, they were desperate. They had to democratize the company even further and scrounge for alternative funding sources. Which leads us right into Section 3, lotteries and tobacco pivots. When that initial business plan failed, no gold, no magical passage to China, the traditional funding totally dried up. They desperately needed a pivot to avoid going bankrupt. The solution? Public lotteries. Seriously. They had company men traveling from town to town across England running these continuous lotteries. For a while, this desperate cash grab was basically the company's only financial lifeline. It actually ended up drawing heavy criticism in Parliament for impoverishing the English public. Think about it. This was essentially 17th century startup vaporware funded entirely by scratch-off tickets. But the ultimate product pivot didn't actually come from the boardroom in London. It came from the ground in Virginia. When John Rolfe successfully planted a sweet-scented variety of tobacco, they finally had a viable cash crop. By 1620, the colony was exporting a staggering 40,000 pounds of it to England every single year. Tobacco officially became the economic engine this startup was so desperately looking for. Section 4. The Great Charter. Even with the new tobacco boom, the company was still drowning in debt by 1618. Completely out of cash, they looked at their only abundant resource, land, and used it to tempt self-funding workers to pay their own way over. This was the headright system. Basically, if you paid for your own passage, you were granted 50 acres of land, and you just had to pay the company a tiny annual fee called a quit rent. It was a brilliant way to shift the immense cost of transport completely off the corporate books. And crucially, right alongside those land grants, the company swapped out strict martial law for a General Assembly, which included the elected House of Burgesses. Now think about what that means for us today. The foundational roots of American democracy weren't born from some high-minded pursuit of liberty. They were actually implemented as a corporate human resources strategy, just a way to keep the labor force from rebelling and to make the whole venture look a bit more appealing to fresh investors. All right, Section 5, Boardroom Wars and Factions. So while things are shifting over in Virginia, back in London, the corporate boardroom is literally tearing itself apart. The company fractured into three fiercely competing factions. First, you've got Thomas Smythe leading the pragmatic businessmen. They just wanted a neutral, profitable enterprise. Then you have Edwin Sandys, representing rebellious politicians wanting to turn Virginia into a base for parliamentary opposition. And finally, the Earl of Warwick. His faction? They actively wanted to use the colony as a piracy base to provoke a war with Spain. Tensions absolutely peaked when Edwin Sandys grabbed control in 1619. This turned the company into a total proxy battleground between Parliament and the Crown. King James was so threatened by this move that he actively tried to block Sandys from leadership. He literally declared, "Choose the devil if you will, but not Sir Edwin Sandys." The boardroom rivalries got so incredibly heated that the king had to put people under house arrest just to stop it from spilling into street violence. Section 6, Bankruptcy and the Royal Takeover. All that corporate infighting, combined with catastrophic events on the ground, finally spelled the end for this massive startup. In 1622, a devastating attack by the Powhatan Native Americans killed 347 English colonists. This triggered a horrifying corporate audit back in London, and what they found was shocking. Out of roughly 4,270 settlers sent over in recent years, only 1,240 were still alive. Those missing 2,683 people hadn't just vanished. The vast majority had been wiped out by disease and starvation under the company's watch. The sheer scale of the disaster was just too big to hide behind marketing spin anymore. Out of spite towards Sandys, Warwick's faction actually leaked highly damaging internal documents right to the king. And this corporate autopsy report was devastating. Over £200,000 of investor capital, an absolute fortune at the time, was lost forever. This massive failure prompted King James to step in and launch a Privy Council investigation into this staggering loss of life and capital. That investigation completely sealed their fate. By 1624, the government officially bailed out the failed startup. The Crown revoked the Virginia Company's charter, dissolved the corporation entirely, and placed Virginia under direct royal control. The venture capitalists had failed, completely and utterly. But here is the amazing part. While the investors lost every single penny they put in, the democratic management structures they created to incentivize their workers, those survived. When Charles I took the throne, he actually affirmed Virginia's right to maintain its elected assembly. So this desperate corporate tool for labor management became a permanent fixture of colonial governance. And that really brings us full circle. I'll leave you with this thought to ponder. The very things that define early America, representative government, private land ownership, and a massive tobacco-driven economy, they weren't part of some grand, visionary master plan. They were born from the desperate, frantic pivots of a failing 17th century startup that was just trying to keep its doors open. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep questioning the history behind the history.